Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Pulitzer Center, thank you so much for being here for Interconnected Reporting the Climate Crisis. We are honored to be in the community with you this week. My name is Christine Spolar, and I am the Climate Labor Editor at the Pulitzer Center. For those of you who have not joined us before, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization dedicated to elevating public engagement with systemic, underreported global issues. We provide over 200 grants each year to freelance and staff journalists, photographers, and filmmakers to pursue the reporting projects in collaboration with news outlets around the world. Interconnected Reporting the Climate Crisis is the Pulitzer Center's 6th annual conference, focused this year on the very urgent crisis facing our planet's coastlines, rainforests, oceans, and the impact on people and communities who inhabit these environments. The Pulitzer Center's newest initiative is funding something called Your Work Environment, and it is a way to look at and investigate how heat and other factors will change the nature of work, or eliminate some jobs, or force innovation, or encourage migration. As a nonprofit journalism organization, the support of our audience and partners sustains this work. And we are very grateful to the Loudest Foundation, which has been supportive of the work on the intersection of climate and labor, to the Norwegian International Climate and Forest Initiative for our work on tropical forests, and to the many individuals and foundations who support our work more broadly. So thank you for being here. Today we have a panel of experts in communication, in heat science, in worker rights, who will help describe the challenges that reporters can explore. Flora Pereira is the International Education and Outreach Program Director at the Pulitzer Center. She has been the director and founder of Africa, a media and education-focused NGO. She's the author of 5 books and was awarded the Brazilian Minister of Culture Prize for Independent Media for her work at Africa. Phaedra Pezzullo is an associate professor at the University of Colorado, Boulder. For decades, she has researched environmental communication, environmental justice, and intersectional climate movements. Her forthcoming book is Beyond Strawmen: Plastic Pollution, Impure Politics, and Networked Cultures of Care. Andreas Flouris is an associate professor at the University of Thessaloniki, Greece, and a visiting professor at the University of Ottawa, Canada. He has published widely on climate change. He is the scientist behind the recent strengthened legislation addressing occupational heat stress in Qatar. And he's an expert scientist for the World Health Organization and the International Labor Organization. And last but not least is Nikhil Dey, who is a social activist and founding member of the MKSS, a workers' and peasants' empowerment organization. The Rajasthan-based MKSS has helped lead successful campaigns for landmark legislation in India for the right to information and the right to work. And we're so pleased that they have all come from very far away for this conference today. So we will start with Flora, who will describe and explain some critical research that the Pulitzer Center did to understand why and how climate and labor has not been really covered very much by the mainstream media. Flora.
Me and my chair adventure. Hi, oh, there it is. Can I pass it? Thank you. Can you hear me well? Okay. Oops. So we carried out last year the Climate Change and Labor Report. It was a media assessment trying to understand, first, what was the importance of the connection between labor and climate? And secondly, how was media covering the topic, and if it was at all? We have divided the research in three pieces. The first was a qualitative interview with it was with 13 experts in labor, climate, and media, some of them sitting in this table with the names of the interviews. We also carried out a quantitative interview with 142 participants over 32 countries with journalists or media professionals to understand how they were covering, how they perceived the topic, and the importance of the topics as well, if there was willing to cover this. We also carried out a digital research using tools as Pezzullo, social media track, to understand and to carry a digital social listening analysis, understanding and comparing how climate change in general is being covered and how climate change is connected to labor issues were appearing as media hits. We interview, as you can see, there are 87 journalists, editors, news directors, producers, and photojournalists for the quantitative. I think, in general, very easy to say this is an underreported topic. It was rarely appeared on the media, as I will show in the next slides. And also the journalist itself had the sense that this was a topic that was being poorly covered or nothing at all. Climate change in the keywords index in the digital media is about only 2% already of the coverage. Climate change in labor, 0.005%. So it's almost nothing. Even when it appeared, it was not appearing exposing the connections Chris just mentioned. It appears as politics, talking about their program. So it was very government policy, financial related, and the voices that were appearing were the governance or the politicals, those in powers talking about works or programs they might be doing, but are not doing itself. Reports itself, investigative reports, were very rare. The journalists would only replicate those stories. So even in this very, very low number, the stories were replicated in themselves. So we could say it's an even lower number than this one. Total silence of the front laborers, total silence of those that were that are being impacted, total silence of the movements representing these laborers, or even the movements and civil society organizations representing climate, discussing this topic. In general, I think one of the most outstanding finding of the research is that it is a question of vulnerability. So people who have contributed less, as we have been speaking before in the launch plenary, are the ones that are suffering their impact more intensely. So normally we talk about indigenous population, we talk about Black communities, we talk about poor urban communities, but laborers are also included in this spectrum. So they are suffering the heat waves, they are suffering with zero labor conditions, they are suffering with zero improvements or changes of the labor conditions, while the weather and the climate are changing on the other hand. Gender is a key perspective in the interaction. So the same way women are being more affected by climate, they are being more affected by the lack of labor, proper labor rights as well. But this is not being covered. So this was a result and a recommendation from the experts, but it was not appearing. These are stories, all these stories that I just shared are stories that are also largely missed by the media. So media is not covering these stories. We try to also understand from these experts, from the journalists itself, what they would find what did they find that was the common mistakes of journalist coverage. First thing was whiplash journalism. That means one story is after the other, so without covering, without stopping to understand the deepness of what is climate change. What does that mean? So without first understand that, without being able to give this total spectrum, it even hard to cover labor. So this bigger pattern of climate change isn't shown. The misrepresentation and lack of diverse forces, especially from the work, as I said before, and especially a framing. This one it's a key for journalists working with labor. There is this framing of trade-offs between economic development and protecting the environment, especially in labor's community. And the workers themselves say they feel judged about it. So they are worried about their jobs, they are worried about those narratives, so they are losing, and they understand sustainability as something that might affect them. So journalists and the investigative reporting also needs to be careful with that. How can we not make this a trade-off, and how can we also not put the blame on the workers that are accepting to be on this carbon industry? No, it shouldn't be their blame. It shouldn't be their fault to be there. So also mention who would be the right actors to show. It was also mentioned other two. There was the globally approach in topics. So saying general discovered media working with a global approach, and I think one that the most appeared was the green solution, when we heard from the Global South specialists that maybe some countries are in different narratives. We run from our great Bangladesh scientists that climate change is well covered and it's well known as an issue in Bangladesh, while, or at least much more known that is in the United States or in other northern practice. So it was not about the unknown of the topic, it was about the jump on engagement, or the jump of hearing those voices. So it's not taking the global solutions and adding to all the other layers in the other countries. And finally, dystopian only frame. So only talking about climate change as a dystopian wouldn't work. So it paralyzed people. Opportunities, and with that I think I'm almost finished. I'll stop a little bit. I will cover a little bit this one. It is, journalists found that despite those lack of media coverage, there is a huge sense of importance of the topic. As you can see in the graphic, like 53% of the respondents agreed that it was a topic that needs to be covered. Also, we are in an important moment of climate communications. There's haven't been there, sorry, but the interest has never been so high. So it's also a moment for journalists to engage in the topic. So public concern has never been highest. Labor is a very tangible prism. It's the day-to-day. All of us, most of us, probably 95% of us are related to labor. So it's a very prism approach to understand climate change. And finally, there is a will on the part of consumers not to the blend of the exploited workers. So it is the role of journalism to connect the dots. So to connect the ones that are exploiting with the consumers and show what is happening. Climate justice frames and focus was one of the biggest recommendations from experts. Messages also need to be nuances, avoiding the one-size-fits-all approach. So yes, maybe some people want to avoid dystopian. That doesn't mean that it should not be done, because some people also need this approach to take action. So I think it's more about understanding who are talking and the audience that you are talking to understand what is the message that needs to be shared. Combination of ambitious local partnership with international journalism was a key topic for the journalists. Like a huge part of them mentioned the potential of this collaboration. And the negotiation between balance against our pessimistic, solulistic approach. Finally, social movements, laborers, are the voices that matter. So the journalists without those voices wouldn't make sense, and probably we wouldn't lead to improvement. They are the ones that know what's happening in the field and are suffering the consequence of climate change. Oops. Thank you very much.
Intimidating speaking after this amazing human being next to me. I just want to start, I've shown this slide at the beginning of every talk I've given since 2019, and I just want to thank you for showing up. There's so many things going on in the world right now, mass shooting, rise of fascism, anti-Black racism, climate change. All of us have been through loss. All of us are exhausted. Every poll I see of journalists, the only people more depressed than journalists are climate scientists. Like, the endless news cycle is just really rough, and nobody knows that more than you. And so I just want to recognize and thank you for being here. And I also want to thank John and Flora and Christine, because this is we've had a few conversations this year about this topic, and I've always loved the Pulitzer Center, and getting to know them better only makes me like them more, which isn't always the case. And I just am grateful that they've made the space for this type of conversation with so many people. Our panel is beginning to talk about labor and climate, and I'm sort of maybe the linchpin between talking about labor and climate more generally and then into labor focused on heat. So I thought I should recognize that I live in Boulder County, Colorado. We have had the largest wildfire we've ever had in the state's history this past year on December 31st, when there was snow on the ground, over 1,000 suburban homes. I know some people on the East Coast, because I'm from the East Coast, think it's all forest out there, but this is like an unusual community to have all of the homes burned to the ground. They were nowhere near a forest, but we had 100-mile-per-hour winds on top of our fire on December 31st. And so now in Boulder, Colorado, we don't talk about a fire season anymore. We just assume we have fires all year round. And so we don't quite have the exhaustion of 24/7 news cycles, but we are getting there with our fire season, with our evacuations. I mention this in case people want to talk in the Q&A, which we've had some conversations about this year, about the different mediums and modalities of journalism these days, because of course I'm assuming most of you know Twitter began with reporting on fires. So in 2007, the idea of a hashtag was created and nobody wanted to use it until the San Diego fire, right? And then it was journalists who made hashtags matter, because you were the ones who were giving that connecting news and also bringing strangers together. I'm very dedicated to journalists thinking about community and building trust, especially local journalists, but a lot of what you do is build a public with strangers, and that happens, that history of multimodality has happened with wildfires. So some people have argued that every story should be a climate story, and I would argue every climate story is a labor story. The transition we face is not just one of changing of fuels and minerals, but also changing how we relate to each other and to the earth. There's little futility in changing one form of exploitation for another, and hopefully people that heard the stories this morning can appreciate that when people were talking about the news coverage of electric vehicles. So writing about labor and climate requires focusing on who, not just the what, right? It's not just follow the tech. It's not just follow the minerals. It's follow the people who are building the cars. It's follow the people that are mining the minerals, right? So often those headlines get told as if they're just objects floating in space, and there aren't human beings with their blood, sweat, and tears working on it. I also, because I'm a professional nerd, just want to talk about labor a little bit, and I'd love to hear your ideas on this. But I think one of the most common tropes for labor is, especially in the United States news coverage, is that if we talk about a just transition, labor is a white, middle-aged, cis coal worker. And we're not talking about the wide range of labor that's involved in this transition. And I think that's one of the big frames we're on the verge of breaking out of and really need to break out of. And that frame was really important. It has created, I am also in the first state in the United States that created a just transition office, but most of that money is going to coal workers, as if there's not whole industries that are shifting and changing over. So as some of you might be familiar with this next, diagram, the NGO Movement Generation Our Power campaign have outlined what they call a just transition framework. Theirs is my favorite to date. And they say a just transition framework resists thinking and restructuring not just about labor, but the entire economy and social relations. So what I like about their map is that they show you that going from that extractive economy to a renewable economy includes not only jobs, but it also includes challenging consumerism, a colonial mindset, exploitation, enclosure of wealth and power, militarism, to something that's a living economy, which would include space for caring and sacredness, which is coming up in a parallel session to ours right now on interconnection, regeneration, cooperation, ecological and social well-being, and deep democracy, right? So the extractivist economy includes not only fossil fuel workers, like that overused trope, but also sex workers at fossil fuel sites, first responders, including prisoners that are used to respond to fires and do other mineral-related work, all the industries that are related to throwaway culture, including fast fashion, fast food, and so forth. We need these stories about the renewable work because persistently, as a political campaign since at least the 1970s, there's been a frame of jobs versus the environment, which has always been a myth. It's always been a myth. There's no renewable energy that's not created without a job. There's no renewable energy, there's no regenerative agriculture without people in the fields. I hope since COVID people recognize the value of farm workers, and of course Nikhil's going to talk about that more, right? But there is no living economy that suddenly the work goes away. If anything, arguably there's more work and more attention that we can talk about in the Q&A. And we also, I would argue, need stories about life beyond work, like Bien Vivir, to talk about what it means to survive, talking about that earlier burnout question. VO is just starting a new section called Even Better, which is an expansion of what they call service journalism, focusing on information, frameworks, and advice on how to live better. I think we're going to keep seeing more and more of that. People want to imagine. There was a great question this morning from someone who asked about the EV coverage. You know, will people just throw up their hands and say, okay, now my EV is evil too, right? And I remember that when I was researching work on the Nissan Leaf plant. The Nissan Leaf plant's in southern Mississippi. It's mostly African-American laborers who are doing it. And Nissan is a union-busting organization. So you're talking about paying the descendants of slaves less than minimum wage sometimes in order to build a Nissan Leaf. Is that your future of sustainability? No. But when I share that, does that make everyone give up and think there's nothing to do? So we have to start finding these stories about, well, what is useful? What can we feel good about? And or get comfortable with the fact that there is compromise in our choices and trying to figure out how do we move towards a better and more just world. As Flora already said so eloquently, the cruel irony of climate change is those that have contributed the least to it are impacted first and worst. I think that story has gotten out more. But these disasters and trends are exacerbated by already existing inequalities. And one of the points I just wanted to underscore that she said is, so often when people go to frontline communities globally and in what we call the global south of the north, like the Gulf Coast or disabled people, it's covered in a model that we call like a deficit communication model, right? That is, we only go to these communities to talk about problems and their experience with challenges and problems. Those stories are very important, of course, to tell, but also it's really important from a frontline perspective to listen to these voices for what are the solutions, right? Are we going to find the solutions by talking to the same elites over and over again? Or maybe it could be the people that are working closest on the ground will have some answers and have been marginalized for far too long. Care work is amongst the essential work that's unpaid. As the Pulitzer report picked up on, this labor is often gendered female. Teachers, grocery workers, healthcare workers, elderly care, child care, and so forth. So we need more stories. I'm just saying this. I know, there's a session at the same time about gender, but I wanted to make sure we brought up what the other two sessions are about. So we get the whole theme of this conference is that it's all interconnected. It's impossible to take out one without tugging on everything else. It's not all intergalactic male egos going to Mars. That's not the story of climate change. That's like the entertainment, but that is not the news story you should be covering. There's a lot more complicated and interesting stories. I think The Intercept has covered some compelling investigation about counterterrorism that was used at Standing Rock, and they've also done something we call expectative journalism, right, where they start to interview experts, policymakers, scientists, frontline organizations on what do they think a future could look like? What does a walkable, bikeable, livable community look like, right? And if we don't have a great example of that in our backyard, like hiring an artist or an infographic person to try to create a design to help people imagine what might that look like. That was also done during the Hong Kong protest, the Pink Umbrella Hong Kong protest, right? To help people imagine, to create a design, to get people to a new place to change the frame and think about a different story. And I'm sharing this hideous slide just for Christine because I know it's going to drive her nuts. This is not what your journalism should look like on the climate anymore, I hope. It's impenetrable. The IPCC reports were really important. In the 1980s, we had a lot of journalists start to cover climate, and they became climate science reporters, became experts on climate, became the main translators of climate science. That's really important. We still need people to do that work. If you're going to do that work, I compel you, and I think this came up at an earlier session, that please cover disinformation if you're going to do that. There's a report that came out today called Deny, Deceive, and Delay on these tactics, on news coverage tactics that end up feeding into these patterns where we don't talk about it. But look at this slide. Who wants to read that in their spare time? We're all working way too hard these days. COVID has hurt all of our attention spans, and nobody wants to use, what's this word? Oh yeah, extirpation. Extirpation is the word for a local extinction event. I don't know about you, but none of my friends are going to be talking about extirpation on the weekend. That is not going to move people. That's not going to create the revolution. It might be a useful term in a small community of scientists, but I think everyone who reads science is already panicked. They're good. They're fine, and they will now know where to go for that information, right? We want to reach everybody else, and that's why labor is such a great, that's why I love this report that Flora put together. It's such a great story because it's so relatable. Everybody knows that they're exhausted. Everybody knows that work is hard. Everybody knows that work is changing, that the jobs the previous generation have aren't necessarily the jobs they're going to have. And even if it has the same title, it feels different. It looks different. You're paid differently. The temperature is different, right? Things are shifting. Everybody knows that. So how do we start conversations on that ground that, like, across the political spectrum, people can recognize that things are changing in the workforce and talk about that as a way of getting into all of these, sorry to use the theme, interconnection. I also, I don't know if anyone has had any time in DC to go around and be a tourist, but I have to say, because I saw the Martin Luther King Jr. statue yesterday, he has an excellent line that all work has dignity. And what he was arguing about when he was assassinated is he was actually helping organize sanitation workers in the United States. That's where the environmental justice movement was going at the time. And that's what was perceived as really threatening, was that he was stopping talking to the elites all the time. He was starting to talk to sanitation workers. And he argued sanitation workers are just important to public health as doctors, because without sanitation workers, if we had trash on the streets, everyone would get sick as well. Well, goodness knows that if you've washed your hands any time in the past 2 years. Yeah? So why don't we give sanitation workers the same respect we give doctors? Why aren't we quoting them in our stories as much as we quote doctors, right? These are people that we know what essential workers are. We know what critical infrastructure is now. We can't say that we didn't know. So how do we tell those stories and tell them well? Then finally, I can share some stories at the end that might work well. The only one I'll highlight right now is I think a good space that this is happening in is the plastics debate. Plastics is a climate story because it's the plan B of the fossil fuel industry. They're trying to make up for their lost profits by turning to plastics. Plastics have exploded in the past 100 years like literally no other commodity on the planet. And you know how any recycling of plastics has ever happened? And yes, only 6 to 9% of plastics ever made have been actually recycled. Waste pickers. There's millions, over 20 million waste pickers in the world who are highly under-interviewed on their expertise of this thing that people do every day as they sit above the recycling bin and say, we call it wish cycling, is this recyclable or not? I hope so, and we throw it in. You know where that goes? That goes to the Global South and it goes to waste pickers. So I hope that these are the types of voices that a session like this can amplify and think about, and I look forward to talking to you more.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you, Pulitzer Center, for creating and giving space to this very important topic. In the next few minutes, I will focus on 5 points that I think may resonate in some of you. The first one is that working in the heat can cause severe health problems. Even a single 8-work-hour shift in the heat can be fatal for some people, especially if they are above 55 or if they have chronic health complications like cardiovascular disease or diabetes. most of the rest of people will just consider 8-hour work shift in the heat as very uncomfortable. Thankfully, our body has survival systems that help us get through this severe physiological stress. However, similar with smoking, day-to-day heat exposure on a working day gradually surpasses the capacity of our body to heal itself. As a result, gradually we have a higher risk of developing chronic disease. For example, those who often work in the heat have twice as high risk of having kidney disease, a terrible condition that leads to death within 8 to 15 years. My second point is that working in a hot environment reduces productivity in a major way. The most important thing that somebody feels when they work in a hot environment is that they slow down their pace. This is a survival mechanism that our body has. As you can see in the graph here, we are most productive when we're working at about 59 degrees Fahrenheit or 15 degrees Celsius. When heat rises beyond that, we just slow down, and this is a natural response. This means that, for example, doing electrical utilities work or any other manual labor job in Arizona, for example, where a typical summer day in June would be around 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius, is about 10% slower than doing exactly the same job here in Washington on a June day, where the average temperature is about 77 degrees Fahrenheit, about 25 degrees Celsius. And we've done many studies in many countries around the world, monitoring thousands of workers on a minute-by-minute basis. And we've seen that the main reason why health problems are caused is because some workers are unable to set their own pace of work. And this can be because of either the nature of the job. Sometimes tasks need to be done in a very fast way, or because of the nature of the payment scheme. Pay by piece is more likely to make workers oversee disregard their instincts, or sometimes it's the type of employer. Some employers adhere to more higher standards of occupational health and safety, whereas others do not, or even exploit their own workers. The third point I wanted to make is that workplace heat exposure creates inequalities. We have seen in many large-scale reports, like the IPCC report that Phaedra just mentioned, that not all countries are treated equal in climate change. Some countries are affected more than others, and unfortunately, countries that are poor and have a limited capacity to adapt are affected more. As a result, think, for example, the world map, and think about the countries that are near the equator, and consider the wealth and the welfare in these countries. And now compare that to the countries in the far north and the far south. Of course, you'll realize that the countries that are close to the equator are poor and fragile. Perhaps the only exception is countries in the Arabian Peninsula. These countries are rich in oil and gas, and this allows them to allows their economies to survive the effects of heat. But perhaps this burden is then transferred to migrant workers who pay the price sometimes. The map that you see here shows the anticipated changes in labor productivity due to climate change, the change between 2000 and 2040, within 40 years. My son is now 10, so when he will be 28, this is how the world is going to be. And look at the regions in red. People living in these regions will find it very difficult to work on a day-to-day basis. Often very difficult to survive in a day-to-day basis. And economies in these regions will be affected severely, and they will start fading. And this brings me to my next point. It is wrong to think that workplace heat exists only in workplaces in the developing world. Yes, indeed, it does, and that's where it's most prevalent. In almost all the articles that I have seen in the media that focus on workplace heat, they do their work, their investigative journalism, in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And as the map shows, this is how it should be, because these areas are affected the most. However, as you can see in the map, there's also red areas also in Europe and in the United States as well, and as well as in many other developed countries. So it is wrong to think that workplace heat is a developing world problem. And as a result of this idea, often people in Western countries think that climate change and workplace heat is something that doesn't affect them. It affects people in other parts of the world. As a result, often they're not as eager to do something about it. And it is up to journalists and scientists and other relevant stakeholders to convince them and make them realize that workplace heat and climate change affect them directly because it makes the conditions in their region worsened, and also because it makes other regions more attractive. Like look, for example, what's happening in large parts of Russia. So some regions will be more attractive and will be improved, and some other regions will be disproportionately affected. Also, the idea that climate change and workplace heat is something that affects somebody else and not me often comes because of the fact that we tend to think it only affects outdoor workers. And yes, most of the time it does. But workplace heat is something much more complex than that. In the studies that we do across the world, technology allows us to measure a number of things, among which is core temperature. We give workers a pill, they swallow it, and then this allows us to record minute by minute, second by second, their temperature throughout their work shift. And the data that you see in this graph show the core temperature of an employee in a specific business. And this is throughout the entire work shift. As you can see, the WHO, the World Health Organization, limit of safety is at 38 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and this particular worker is below that limit. Sometimes reaches close to that, but throughout the work shift stays below than that. But then we have another worker who spends the vast majority of their work shift beyond that. This means that this worker is very likely to have serious health complications, especially if it happens on a day-to-day basis. And the irony here is that these two workers are working exactly at the same time, exactly at the same business. The one is a waiter waiting tables, and the other one is a chef working in the kitchen of the same restaurant. This is not a restaurant in the developing world. This is a restaurant in a large hotel in the Mediterranean. One final point I wanted to make is that journalists can facilitate policy changes by holding governments accountable for what's happening. And journalists, what Flora showed us in the beginning, the lack of visibility on the impacts of workplace heat on the people is unacceptable. And journalists can use events like heat waves or large sports events as windows of opportunity to show the spotlight on what's happening. One example is the World Cup, the Football World Cup that's happening in a few months in Qatar. For several years, when Qatar was awarded this tournament, there was a spotlight on what's happening in that country. And this created change. And I was fortunate to be asked to contribute to a new legislation which actually was, after years of research, I was actually adopted by the Ministry of Labor exactly as suggested, with 0 changes. And look at what happened within a year. The bars that you see there show hospitalizations in the years 2019 and 2020, before the new legislation, and the green bars show what happened within the first year. And if we use what scientists call the odds ratio, which basically is the likelihood that something will happen, you can see that it drops to half. So within the first year, hospitalizations were reduced by half. And imagine what's going to happen if more and more companies start to do that, and they realize and they learn the measures and they adopt them a lot more. So what I wanted to make and close with, what I wanted to say to close, is that we need to not just talk about what we can do, but we need to do what we can to solve this problem. And your contribution, ladies and gentlemen, is key to doing that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you can keep it, thanks. Thank you so much to the Pulitzer Center, to everyone here, my fellow panelists, to them particularly because of how much, in a sense, it leads up to my saying whatever I will say over these next few minutes. The two sessions I heard this morning were also, for me, very, very useful. Two words stand out a lot for me. One was the word appetite, and the other was the word impact. I think there's too much appetite and too little impact. The appetite of the world I see around me, from the time I left New Delhi, to the plane, to the change in London, to Washington, and all that I saw around me, shows actually the kind of appetite that exists in this world. That's a model for how the world should run and will continue to be the model from all that one can see. How can you possibly have impact in climate change? If I were to think that this is the model and tomorrow I snap my fingers and the India that I have come from, everyone leads a lifestyle half of how people in DC, and I'm not talking about the elites in DC, I'm talking about everyone else were to live, the earth is over. So I think when we are trying to talk about what impact, what solutions, we have to understand that we are not dealing with changing from fossil fuels to nickel-based electric vehicles. We have to address the fundamental issues of the way that we have shaped this earth. I come from what I have to say today comes actually from the lessons of people I've worked with for 30, 35 years. I don't have answers. But it's taken those 15, 20, 30 years with workers and peasants to be able to understand that they have answers. And why do they have answers? Because they are not beneficiaries of this structure at all. They are victims. They are victims in the work they do. They are victims of the higher and worsening conditions of climate change. And they are victims in that they do not even get the fruit of their labor, what they do. I come from an organization, this is a home which is its headquarters, this what you see here, of the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, a peasant and workers organization. For 35 years, it's been the headquarters of that organization. Tiny, small, representing and working with thousands of workers, has brought about has led a lot of things that have led to legislative change even in a country like India. But it doesn't require huge resources to do that. It actually requires an understanding that if you want to work for change, you have to be in tune with the kind of change that you want. It has to represent that somewhere lifestyle between how we live our lives and the thoughts that we think have to match. And that includes all of us in this room, all of us who are engaged in these kinds of things. It includes journalism. It includes people who are policymakers. But I don't see much hope coming out of those who are benefiting from it. So therefore, to me, why I work and worked in the place that I have is because I think they have a vested interest in change. And they are the ones who will drive that change. And as Phaedra said, and as everyone else here has said, Flora has said, they are the ones who will provide us some kinds of solutions. And I'll very briefly touch upon their own voices. The question today, when they face these, if we can take the next slide, I'm going to speak about actually entire laws through just slogans, because it's their voice. And often people don't write PhDs and don't write studies and papers. They speak through their songs and their slogans. A slogan that encompassed the entire National Rural Employment Guarantee Act in India was a 20-year campaign saying, Har haath ko kaam do, kaam ka pura daam do. Give every hand work, give every work a just reward. What was their just reward? It was not millions of dollars, it was just minimum wages, a demand for work at minimum wages. And it resulted in an Employment Guarantee Act, which today in India guarantees every rural resident work at minimum wages within 5 kilometers of their house, 100 days to every household. 100 million people go to work every year under this program. $12 billion are spent every year under this program. 250 kinds of public works are done under this program, and all the public works are actually regenerative. They hold water, they plant trees, they make sure that there is water harvesting all around, they make sure that pasture land is regenerated. It is tiny, tiny little development infrastructure works around their own homes and their own areas. Machines are banned, contractors are banned. In other words, profits are banned. It is that profit and consumerism that is driving us absolutely in a direction where there is no return. We can have conferences like that. We should have conferences like this. But do our conferences actually provide an answer? Because we are still not willing to accept that this is something that is we understand that disaster is coming towards us, but we still want to hang on to this and say there is some alternative way. May not be conquering Mars, but there is some alternative way even within our own structure, without understanding that our comfort has to be left somewhere. If we go to the next slide, this is another this is something 5 years ago, even though I've worked in that area for 40 years, I understood silicosis. Heat we are talking about. By the way, in the last slide, the 100 million workers who work in the country, in my state, Rajasthan, where I work, there are 10 million workers, mostly women, 70% women. Today, Rajasthan, if you saw in that map that India is red, Rajasthan is the desert state of India. It is reddest of red today. Today, women are working at 45-degree temperatures. 45 degrees, what, 110, 112 degrees Fahrenheit today. Today, women are striking in their organized work to say we will come to work at 5 in the morning and leave by 8. We'll finish our work because it's productivity based. They don't get their wages unless they produce the amount they're supposed to produce, unless they dig the amount of earth they're supposed to dig. So they are saying we'll come at 5, and if we don't finish, we'll come back again after the sun is set. They don't have the instruments Andreas has, but their bodies tell them that that's all that they can do. That's the only way, and they fight for that. They're fighting for that. These are people who work there in stone quarrying and mining, and they've got silicosis. And the picture you see here are people holding up their certification of silicosis. They are all on death row. This is in one district. There are people who will, in the next 3 years, this was taken 3 years ago, bulk of them will have died. If you get in a district 1,000, 1,500 people with silicosis, and that's producing all kinds of things, from stones, from our houses, from quartz, to all silica is a byproduct. That dust is from all kinds of things. So whether it's heat, or whether it's dust, or whether it's the conditions under which you're working for someone else's benefit, because they are not even getting anything that will give them a dignified life, just a minimal dignified life. But they are forced to do it by force of circumstances. So the slogan in this case that you see there, actually you don't see that, it wasn't written there, was Aapka Awas, your homes, Hamara Vinash, our destruction. Ye kaisa vikas, what kind of development is this? So the question that they're asking is that the cost of our destruction is the cost of your living. And that living is not very long, but that's a question that climate change raises for all of us. If we go to the next slide. So where do these solutions come? So solutions, obviously, I also don't have instant solutions. But one of the campaigns in India that we fought for that came out of the workers' movement, it came out of their demand for minimum wages, was the Right to Know campaign, the India's very robust Right to Information campaign. And one very powerful slogan of that campaign, there were two, I won't get into the other one, was, Hum janenge, hum jiyenge, the right to know, the right to live. Because they understood that unless they knew, they would not get their benefits, they would not get their food, they would not get their wages, and of course, even in climate change, they would not know how to survive silicosis or survive the heat that Andreas talks about, because they need to know what all of us know. And once they know, they can fight. And maybe that's the only way all of us will be brought to our knees to change. When those millions of workers put pressure, because we are not going to change on our own. And I include myself in that. The elites, those who speak English, those who can relocate and do whatever they like, those who can dream that they can go to Mars and survive, we are not going to be actually the ones who are going to bring about change. So if we can empower these people as they are empowering themselves, if we can recognize the wisdom in what they have. So this is Employment Guarantee Act workers in one little town called Byawar, women, at the end of a rally. And there are thousands of them all over the country, and they are organizing. And the slogan here that they have written is, Jawabdehi Kanun Pass Karo, pass the accountability law. And where is the solution to my mind? Yes, it is the right to know and the right to live. But the current law that they are fighting for is for a social accountability law. Accountability to the people. Accountability, bottom-up accountability. Not accountability to some parliament or Congress, but accountability to the people who matter, because they will ask the questions to save their own lives. They will ask the questions that are very necessary. Finally, so their slogan in this is, we have questions, we want answers. And we want that accountability law. It's a 10-year campaign. So let's go back to the Employment Guarantee Act for 2 minutes. What did it do in 20 years of fighting? It did not ask for anything that was destructive. It was collective wisdom that asked for, if there ever is a Green New Deal, to me, it's that employment guarantee law. It is the idea that you can do little works in your own place without destroying the environment, in fact, regenerating the environment at a standard of living that is sustainable. So it's a powerful thing, and it came out after so many years. I'll just conclude in half a minute. But similarly, I want to say that for journalists, what do we say? Since this is something that we've been talking about. I don't think it's to provide, journalists have to provide the truth, and we've seen powerful examples of that from this morning. But I think somewhere we have to ask that one extra bit of truth. That is this eventually going to lead to the impact that we want? What is our understanding of where impact will come from? And that impact can only come from workers. That impact can only come from people who are actually at that end, both sustaining the earth, but not sustaining themselves. And they will provide an answer, if we listen to them, and that's where journalism can play that role, of showing how both the earth and themselves and people can be sustained. Not an answer today, but maybe some hope of an answer.
So thank you all. Is this on? Thank you all. This is the start of a terrific little panel discussion. We don't have that much time, but I wanted to go back to both Nikhil and Andreas and to talk about something that came up yesterday at the Rainforest seminar, and also perhaps this morning, the real need and the integrity of the rule of law in looking at climate and work, and knowing what the law is, and studying the law, and knowing what the parameters are for work. And there have been a lot of studies about India, which is why I was so pleased that Nikhil could join us, and about the threats to India. Is it going to be too hot to work? But as I understand, and perhaps you can correct me if I'm wrong in this, but governments that have instituted, whether they're ministers of heat, and some have done that, or laws that regulate how much people can work, because of COVID and the loss of GDP under COVID, that a lot of these laws are to the wind. And in fact, people are ignoring them, and nobody's calling them to task. And so now you have some very nice, bright, shiny laws on the record, and you have people developing kidney disease and other diseases and dying young lives. I wonder if you could speak to that if I'm wrong. I do believe that's happened during COVID, but Nikhil, why don't you talk first, and then perhaps Andreas.
Yeah, the first set of laws that were passed immediately after COVID were to remove amendments in labor laws, were to remove the requirement of an 8-hour working day. It was just incredible. After India's migrant population had been practically plastered to the wall and destroyed, all that people, the elites were concerned about and governments were concerned about was getting the economy going again, back to that growth rate, which is the only god of both of existence and profit. So yeah, India has some progressive laws, but they don't get implemented because, again, the people who are implementing them don't benefit from that implementation. And therefore, the only way out is to organize people so that they can start getting laws that are of benefit to them implemented. So I think Qatar and India, I mean, it's an extraordinary story. I'd really like to understand more. But we not only need laws, but we need those people empowered to be able to make sure that those laws work. And we need to make sure, because the other way around, the laws do work. When it benefits those who are in this whole capitalist enterprise or neoliberal enterprise of profits and consumerism, then those laws work because the powerful are making them work. So I think that is very true. A good legal framework is important. I mean, in our story, in the place where I am, there have been fights for one law after the other. And India's right to information law, there are 8 million users a year. 100 people have lost their lives because they are pursuing that law, because it is a people's law.
I think Nikhil covered me completely. I totally agree with you, Christine, that they're implementing the laws is certainly the crucial thing. However, not having any to implement is ridiculous, I think. There's, I think, 4 countries in the world right now that have legislation for working in hot environments. Malaysia, Cyprus, Qatar. These 3 countries have quite effective evidence-based legislations. China, a few years ago, introduced some legislation that is questionable. It's not based on, it's certainly better than nothing, but it's not based on evidence. And now I was really happy to hear that the US a few months ago started a process that may lead to something. It's not certain yet. I do hope so. Greece is also trying. I'm really trying my best to convince politicians to do something about this. But it's a very important first step to have something so that it can be implemented. Yeah, sorry.
You had talked to me at one point. We were talking about Qatar, and you said, "Well, yeah, but you could look at Spain too, for some of the problems that you were seeing in Qatar." Can you talk about that? And you were also talking about that earlier about these developing countries also have the same problems, but they're not focused on them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, yes. So often we focus on specific countries, but I've seen conditions of Qatar, for example, being better than South Europe. I've witnessed workers in construction in Spain working in much harsher conditions and much less protected than workers in Qatar. That doesn't mean that workers in Qatar should not be protected or that conditions are not harsh there as well. Not at all, actually. But there are often many countries that we don't think about, and there's major issues and no one is talking about them. We only focus on specific parts of the planet, and we forget that there's major issues in many other places in the world, and no one is really paying any attention, including, of course, developing countries where definitely the problem is at its highest, because manual labor is done there for the most part, and also because conditions are getting worse and worse.
And one other thing that you had mentioned, the technology for judging heat on a person's body has just progressed greatly in the last 5 years. So when you did your study of workers in Qatar for looking at what was happening, swallowing that pill was a tremendous advancement over laboratory work that had been done with heat on the body. And there's even more. Now people are wearing vests that can show what the heat is. If you want to
Absolutely, yes. So technology in the last 6 to 7 years has advanced a lot. We now can measure so many things. I was actually also, it's great to see also investigative journalism doing the same in other fields as well. So there's vast amount of data, amounts also in heat physiology, as we call it. Scientists now have amazing data on exactly minute by minute changes on the body, not in the lab as we used to. In previous decades, work had been done, but it was confined in the lab. We were trying to simulate what a person feels at work. We were simulating that by having somebody walk on a treadmill. But this obviously has no ecological validity, as we say in research. So now we're able to venture out and go to the field and see what's actually happening, and monitor workers on a minute-by-minute basis throughout thousands of hours of work shifts. And then we have now the evidence to draw conclusions and adopt effective legislation, whereas before our evidence was not as strong. Certainly not.
I'm happy to open this up to questions. If people would like to, please use the microphones and go right up and ask questions.
I have a somewhat tangential question. I guess this is for Nikhil.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with Kim Stanley Robinson's novel Ministry for the Future, which has this absolutely heartbreaking and frightening opening scene about something called a wet bulb incident. And he just describes this scenario in which the humidity and temperatures rise to such a point that something like 20 million people in his telling die. And I don't know if anyone else on the panel is familiar with this. It's just one of the most riveting and frightening depictions of the near future that we might experience. And I'm just wondering, even if you haven't read it, how far into the future do you envision, and it takes place in southern India, where the setting is. How far in the future are we where parts of southern India become uninhabitable or become impossible to work? And we see in the hottest times of the year lots of people dying.
Yeah, I don't think just southern India, all of South Asia and many other parts of the world. Last year, one of the things that employment guarantee law brought about was a social audit mechanism. And last year, someone sent us 2 years ago something on Bangladesh and social auditing their climate change program. The program is so lacking in imagination. You put some wall somewhere, you do some little culvert somewhere else, I mean, you're not addressing the issue at all. So how far in the future, I can't tell. I'm not an Andreas, and I'm not, and neither are the people I work with. And honestly, I gather my understanding from the people and different kinds of processes to come to this place. But at least this much I know that when auditing those kinds of works, it's clear that you're just playing around with this idea that, okay, here is a global fund for dealing with climate change, and that fund is of no value. You may as well not have it because you're not addressing the core issues. And I think even on technology, I just want to say that, in the silicosis example, for instance, people earlier used to die, but die in their 50s and 60s. Technology has been used to increase productivity. So the dust is that much more. And so they're dying in their 20s. There are entire villages where half the village has widows because the mine workers who are there have died, large numbers. And so it's technology, again, certainly can tell us many things, but it's who is the master. And it keeps coming back to that same issue. So southern India, I mean, if India has to have any hope, it has to be that those people who are going to suffer, because the elites in India will also leave. They'll find some other Mars. But it has to be the people who have no choice to go anywhere, who have to be able to get power into their hands. And then perhaps all of us will see some degree of sense. So, and we don't have a wet bulb.
If I may add a point there. Keep in mind also, Nikhil and everybody, that heat also, one of the defense mechanisms of our body to get rid of heat is to breathe faster and heavier. So one of the things that hyperthermia does is increases inhalation of airborne pollutants. Dust, silicosis, anything. So even if we run outside just as exercise, if we run in the heat and we run in a polluted environment, we will inhale a lot more pollutants than if we run exactly at the same pace in a colder environment. So heat also adds to silicosis as well.
Kim Stanley Robinson's great because he's married to a climate scientist. And she keeps him straight, and therefore his books, his climate fiction is more informed than most. And Nikhil can address more if we want to talk about more, but I know there's another question. One of the other exacerbating effects, though, of course, is suicides. So there's been a lot of suicides of farmers in India and elsewhere in the world because heat increases everything. Heat increases your exposure to a whole set of public health issues, but it also emotionally takes a toll on people, right? And so that's why this theme of interconnected is just, I'm sorry to keep coming to it. I usually don't with conference themes. I usually find them really cheesy, but there is the U.S. military calls it a multiplier effect. Interconnected sounds much nicer. And that is that the climate change in India is also leading to a lot of that. I don't know if you want to talk about that at all, but we can pass on that and wait for another question.
Yeah. Could you use the microphone? Yeah. Yeah. Wait, it's
what happened?
the micro. Yeah, I think he has a phone call. Yes. Could you use the microphone? Yeah, I think.
Thank you for seeing me. I was like, oh, is he
I am
okay?
very curious to understand, like, if there is going to be a huge role, or what are your hopes in this kind of unionization movements coming back to US, and you think what's going to be the role, and if they're going to be engaged or not with this important topic?
Yeah, I mean, there needs to be a global solidarity of workers, undoubtedly, because workers, as Andreas said, no matter where in the world, are doing work. They're not sitting at home on computers. So they can't work from home. They have to be out there in the fields and or at factory workplaces and other places, and no matter what you will. And perhaps that solidarity, because they can influence their own countries much more than people from the global south can. So those solidarities are again something that journalists can help build. I do want to say that journalists, I think, really what Phaedra said is that you have to be able to see that the solutions lie there. It's not just that you're communicating to them this crazy language of COP26 or carbon sink, which makes no sense at all. It is that you pull stories out of there and maybe feed them back to them, because that's how opinion gets built and solutions come. And that role of journalism, I mean, what's happening now is, yes, climate change is reported, but in a completely facile manner. It means nothing to people there. And they actually understand what's happening with climate change, and that wisdom is not coming out either. So there needs to be these solidarities, and these journalism can play a huge role in building these solidarities. And those are our audiences, actually.
Go ahead, Flora. No, you're exactly the person who should speak.
No, I think one of the things that appeared in the research is that we were talking about how to hear the labors on labor and climate, but it also appeared that there are labor movements and labor organizations. It's not that the climate speech or the climate communication is not there. It is, but in other language. It is, but not using the wording climate change or global warming. It is all there. So it is an opportunity in this sense, or it is the responsibilities of us and journalists and activists to connect these dots. And media experts, science experts, they share it, how those labor movements would be interesting in engaging with climate change movements, not because they don't know, but they use a different language. And how do we connect those expertises? Like, because as I mentioned, as a result of his research as well, it is once in a while time for communicating climate. People are interested, at least more than ever. Even if still slow, it's more than ever. So it's also a way to make policy, is also a way to be more effective in policy change.
And I want to put in a plug for the Pulitzer Center's use of education out in the field with the universities at the grade school level. The more that you can get it into the community and make it part of the discussion. The Pulitzer Center is one of the few organizations I know with journalism that actively goes and tries to make education central to what makes journalism vibrant. And for me, it's one of the best things about this organization. And just to put in a plug, as a nonprofit journalism organization, the support of our audience and partners sustains the work. So if you were inspired by what you hear today, please consider supporting the vital mission here. And it's www.pulitzercenter.org/donate. That's the big word. So thank you. I think we have time for another question. And Manuela, yes, sure.
Hi. I was very interested in the law you mentioned that had a huge impact. I'm just wondering if there's other legislation that comes to mind that had such an immediate impact, in which places that you could give examples of.
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, this is the only place, and because of you, first of all, this legislation passed. It's important to recognize this. And because of the pressure that was applied by journalists, the International Labour Organization and the Ministry of Labour in Qatar were very careful in monitoring the effects. In other parts of the world, the three other countries that had enacted similar legislation, I don't know how it happened. Obviously, there wasn't so much pressure. Maybe there was a good politician there. But because of not enough pressure, maybe they weren't careful enough to show the results. So long story short, as far as I know, there's no other study that monitored before and after. The other countries are Malaysia, Cyprus, and China.
Yeah, sure, I think so.
It seems to me that temperature is going to keep on going up. I mean, we're not addressing this problem. And even if we did address it today or in the near future, temperature would keep on going up because there's sort of a flywheel effect. And so, I mean, all these people, let's say the the people in India in the hottest places, they're not going to all get air conditioning. And they're probably not going to want to stay around if people around them are dying. They're going to migrate. And so it seems to me like migration is the sort of twin of the problem you're talking about. It's going to, these problems are just going to lead to that. And I wonder if you want to talk about that. It seems like it's to some extent, this morning we heard about these, how the European Union is trying to keep these migrants out of coming across the Mediterranean. We have to look at that and think what's going to happen in the future when that's multiplied by I don't know what.
The only thing I'll share that from the, because I would like to hear from the experts, of course, but is in the research, the very few good reporting on climate change in labor was related to migration.
If I may, this is a brilliant observation. I come from Greece, and we've been experiencing major inflows of migration in the last decade or so. Obviously, not all of it is related to climate change. So we've started a large-scale analysis in my lab in the last few years to try to quantify how many of those who migrate because of climate change. And I can share, it's not published yet, I can share with you some preliminary data which shows that about 20 to 30% of people who migrate because of climate change, either directly because there was a fire or a flood in India and they had to leave, or indirectly because slowly the soil is degrading and there's no raining and they have to migrate. So either directly or indirectly, about 1/3 of people who move are because of climate change. And in Europe we've been seeing, and also in the US, it's been coming and intensifying. So certainly this is the world that we're going to be living in the next few years.
I have to try and say one thing. I just still feel that if we do not, even as journalists, question this idea that growth is development, everything that we've said here, I mean, you can tinker around. 150 billion people can't migrate. Who will migrate? The elites will migrate, who already migrate. The rest will have to sit and die, which we saw in COVID. Indian internal migrant populations, how badly they were affected. Somewhere we have to question, and we don't enough, not even here. We don't enough question that our model on which we are basing everything is just not workable. That has to be questioned, however long it takes, however much it takes, but that has to be questioned. There is no other way.
It would seem that elites migrate, but people who are not elite migrate as well, as we heard this morning from the people who were drowning in the Mediterranean after leaving Africa, who weren't necessarily elites. I get what you're saying, but I do think that some people who aren't elite also pick up.
No, sure. I'm just saying the options are not there for the vast numbers. Those numbers are just huge. Some of them will leave. Some from Bangladesh will go here and there. But those options don't exist for most people. You can buy your way out. You can buy an air conditioner. You can buy air. You can get purifiers. That's what the entire elites all over are doing, whether of all services. But there are large numbers of people who just don't have those options. And that's something that we need to recognize. They are living undignified, completely threatened lives right now.
I would like to take one more question because you've been waiting so patiently there, but it has to be a little brief because we're over time.
Okay, I'll be very quick. It's a pretty basic question. This is for Professor Flouris, but we've spoken of this law many times. I was wondering, what does the law mandate? The one in Qatar.
Okay. Yeah, it has several articles. I can tell you first of all, you can find there's a lot of it. You can find a lot of it online because we've also helped them create videos, animations for the workers, pamphlets in many different languages. I can tell you the most important things. First of all, there's now there's an expansion of the forbidden hours of work, as they call them. So there's certain hours that workers are not allowed to work outdoors. This was already in effect. Now it's much longer during the day and also much longer during the season. It starts earlier in the summer and it ends later. Second, and most importantly, there's legislation now that workers are allowed to self-pace and take breaks. And because we have seen our work has shown that if you allow people to self-pace, the risk is reduced tremendously. There's also mandated health checkups every year for workers to make sure that they don't have chronic disease that predisposes them to have a health condition. And also the fourth is that before the heat season every year, all workers have to go through heat training to recognize symptoms, to know what they need to do, and they also have body systems, and you need to take care of your body and all that. So these are the main things, but there's like 19 articles, if I remember correctly, but these are the main points.
I do want to point out that what I find very difficult to figure out as a journalist for the past 30-odd years is how best to communicate these stories, whether through multi-platform, through podcast, through long stories. And I know from talking to Andreas and Nikhil, these 35, 40-inch stories or 10,000-word stories are not getting to the population that needs to read them. So I'm very interested when you want to show me your tree, or you want to do a program of some kind that is social media with effect, that people then can pursue more information. I just think we have to work across platforms and generations to reach them, and I am so thankful that we had experts from Greece and India willing to come to explain their real life experiences. They are experts. They are unknown. Write down their names, get their emails, use them in stories, and they can give you more people to talk to. And hopefully journalists on the ground who are also effective. There's so much to talk about. We could be here twice the time. But I'm thanking all of you. And thank you for coming.
And more labor this afternoon. The next panel on labor.
Thank you.
There is a panel this afternoon that will be talking. There will be editors from the New York Times, Time Magazine, Bloomberg, who have done, it's their climate editors. They will be describing how and why they decided to cover things the way they do, and feel free to challenge them.